Tonight on Nation to Nation, cabinet resignations this week have the Prime Minister on the ropes, but a First Nations leader in BC says a Conservative government could be troubling.
We're going to be in a huge struggle and constantly be in fight mode as First Nations people across this country.
The Métis National Council imploded over the past year. A new leader was elected, but with little support. One political pundit questions its future.
I don't know if there's a way forward for the Métis National Council at this time. There's no clear way forward.
And although the federal government says it will not be moving forward on Bill C-53, the president of the Métis Nation of Alberta says the organization will continue its pursuit of self-government.
Well, our self-government journey is not tied to the outcome of any single piece of legislation.
Welcome to Nation to Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. It has not been a good week for Justin Trudeau's Liberal government. Housing Minister Sean Fraser announced that he would be leaving cabinet and not seeking re-election. And on Monday morning, just hours before she was supposed to give the fall economic statement, Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland posted her resignation letter on social media. Dominic LeBlanc is the new Finance Minister, but questions remain about the future of Trudeau. Joining us today to talk about it is Cheryl Casimir, who's a member of the First Nations Summit, British Columbia First Nations Leadership Council, and serves as chief as the Acom First Nation. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you. Thank you, Fraser.
So I guess you were probably following Monday's events like everyone else with Chrystia Freeland resigning on Monday. What was your initial thoughts, I guess, when you saw all the stuff that was happening here?
Well, when I first saw it, it was the first thing I saw when I woke up, and I was like in a bit of shock. I was like, what? Is this really happening? And why is this happening? So yeah, it was a bit of a shocker.
And it brings back again sort of Jody Wilson-Raybould's experience in the government, I guess, another female minister, and questions are being risen here about Trudeau's leadership, but also the way he treats women in leadership positions in general. Is that something that's resonated with you as well?
I did put the two of them together initially because Minister Freeland was definitely a loyal member of his government and has been for quite some time now. So it's obviously a telltale sign that when someone is as loyal as she was to her government, to put in a resignation fairly quickly, it indicates that there's definitely is some turmoil and that there's some problems that are happening internally.
And of course, we're talking in the lead up a little bit about this is really, these sort of high level, these internal divisions within the Liberal Party sort of taking away maybe some of the, from what people are talking about on the ground in First Nations communities, of course, housing, water. There's so many things going on that people are just struggling on a day-to-day basis. In terms of the government here, though, what do you think will or should happen next, I guess, with the Prime Minister and also the
Well, I know that there's a vote of confidence that keeps on happening almost on a weekly basis, right? And something is going to come as a result of that. We may be looking at an election sooner rather than later. But I think that when you're in the position of leadership and you see that things are crumbling all around you, you have a couple of things you can do. You need to shift your manner in which you're doing things and make some significant changes to kind of regroup. And failing that, then you need to say, well, how effective am I being, right? Am I really being effective in terms of representing the people's interests and their priorities? So I think I think we're at that point in time right now with the Liberal government. It's a matter of saying, if I'm not being effective, then I need to do something to change that. We're talking about people's lives here, right? It's not about trying to maintain a level of popularity to stay in the office as Prime Minister. If you're failing the people, then you're not doing your job.
Now, the government has been struggling for really about, I guess, a year and a half to 2 years almost now, like in the polls, and that reflects sort of, the housing crisis, which of course affects First Nations people greater than the rest of the population, some of these issues of affordability, stuff like that. And they've tried to reset, but haven't been all that successful. Do you think the Prime Minister and his cabinet caucus can still go back and stay in government and be maybe effective if they change, or is it too far gone and that we need either a new prime minister, Liberal leader, or an election?
Well, if we go back to a Conservative government, which seems to be the likelihood here, I think that we're going to be in a huge struggle and constantly be in fight mode as First Nations people across this country. We have had experiences already with the Harper government, and that was an uphill battle for every little thing that we were able to get. Conservatives are definitely not our friends when it comes to dealing with First Nation issues and priorities in the country. The Trudeau government, Liberal Party, was a bit more, I guess, open to trying to strengthen the relationship. I mean, he continuously talks about how there's no other relationship more important to him than that with First Nations in this country. But we need to see more action to those words. The government has, enacted legislation to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples through the UNDA legislation, right? And then they established an action plan. Not a lot of movement or advancements are being made on the action plan because the federal government really hasn't made that commitment to support First Nations to be able to sit at tables where there are legislative amendments being contemplated. Here in British Columbia, we have the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. We also have an action plan that supports the implementation of that work, and the provincial government set aside $200 million to support First Nations participation and engagement. Federal government has not even considered that, even though they've been called upon to provide capacity resourcing to allow nations to be fully engaged and for them to be able to obtain our free, prior, and informed consent. So things are happening too slow at the federal government level. We've recently we're dealing with the fallout that came as a result of the rejection of the final settlement agreement of the $47.8 billion. We're trying to get Canada back to the table so we can renegotiate based on terms that have been agreed to by leadership across the country, and they're kicking and dragging their feet and they're stalling. I don't know what will happen if we don't get back to the table with them and a new government comes into play. I don't think that Poilievre is very interested in reaching $47.8 billion agreements with First Nations on any matter, to be honest with you. So it's critical Canada gets back to the table because we're talking about children's lives here.
We'll have to leave it there just for time purposes, but I know you're very busy, so thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Up next, we'll talk to Hill Times columnist Rose LeMay about her latest column on the current state of the Métis National Council. Welcome back. The Métis National Council is in a state of disarray in recent months. Earlier this year, Métis governments in Saskatchewan and British Columbia left the organization. The future is even more uncertain after Cassie Caron stepped down as president this fall, and Victoria Pruden took over earlier this month. Hill Times columnist Rose LeMay gives us an outsider's view or take on the current state of the MNC in her latest column, and she joins me today to talk about this and the latest happenings on Parliament Hill. Welcome back to Nation to Nation.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So I guess I thought I would, obviously First Nations person, but you decided to write about the MNC. You don't always see that other than sometimes sort of in a negative way of saying, basically infringing on territory, things like that. But what made you decide to write about that?
More and more people have asked me to write about the National Indigenous organizations, that they should also have some coverage in the same way we might cover other big groups that get the news. And so I was thinking about it, and then this story broke around Manitoba Métis Federation pulling its support from Métis National Council, which is not a surprise. I suspect a lot of people saw it coming. But it really brought to attention the role that NIOs, National Indigenous Organizations, have played in the history of Canada since the 80s, and what would happen if one becomes insolvent or becomes inconsequential. Then what happens? And I was intrigued.
Okay, yeah. And so what, it appears like that, I mean, they do have a new president, but it really, they do appear to be really kind of scrambling after Cassie Caron left. What do you think may happen or should happen?
Given that the Métis National Council is allegedly there to represent Métis interests in negotiations with the federal government, it's concerning that there is no longer a national. It is regions, a couple of regions, which already have questions about their authenticity and their membership list. I don't know if there's a way forward for the Métis National Council at this time. Certainly there's no clear way forward. It would leave a gaping hole in terms of negotiations. There are communities in Alberta, obviously Red River area, that would benefit from a voice, and I'm not sure how that will proceed.
Yeah, from the stories we've covered, and you probably read as well too, the real outlier sort of is the Métis Nation of Ontario. That seems to be the issue with the other Métis governments, and also with, of course, First Nations as well here in Ontario. What do you think? Maybe how could they come to maybe a way forward on the Métis Nation of Ontario? Because that seems to be really the sort of sticking point.
Well, that's a sensitive question. I'm not sure I want to answer that as a First Nations person, but let me just share two things. The Identity Summit that Chiefs of Ontario and Manitoba Métis Federation held earlier this year, I think was a seminal conference, and it really was trying to get at Métis identity and how they track it and who are Métis and therefore who are not. And that was a seminal conference, and I remember listening to some of the knowledge keepers from Métis and their elders, so to speak, and talking about how Métis after Louis Riel moved west, not east. And it raised a lot of question around who is actually Métis. The other thing that I just like to say is also what I've heard from Métis elders, and they often refer to that they are closely related to us as First Nations, and so a community that is purportedly Métis and might not be, and if its sole purpose is to fight against First Nations, that should raise a lot of questions. Is that we have had treaties amongst ourselves for generations. These are the first and important treaties between Indigenous nations, between ourselves. And if those are not playing out today, then we should have some serious questions.
Okay, so now I'd like to move on to, of course, stuff that's going on this week. I have to ask you about just sort of all the craziness with the finance minister resigning abruptly on Monday, and government seems to be a bit of turmoil. What's your thoughts on all this?
You know, if a First Nation put a budget out that was something like that much higher than their proposed deficit, we would ask for third-party management. We would think this is a terrible way to govern. Overall, what is going to happen, I have no idea. My best bet was wrong on Saturday. It was wrong on Monday. I don't know. I think Justin Trudeau is going to try and wait it out to the detriment of this country again. He waited out a little bit of a question of his leadership in the summer. I think he's going to try that again.
Yeah, so another issue I want to talk to you about too, there's that issue of just, sort of chaos in the government, but also now this is yet another female minister, high profile, that, has left in a conflict, brings back sort of Jody Wilson-Raybould, and what's your thoughts on that in terms of the way this Prime Minister, calls himself a feminist, but seems to have trouble dealing with women when they oppose him?
There seems to be a certain trend. I remember Jane Philpott, Minister of Health. She was great. She, along with the three who decided to leave or were kicked out, depending on the story, there seems to be a pattern. But there's also a pattern around just pretty poor decisions. That night, after all the news broke out of Freeland deciding to leave, to quit, and that night there was a fundraiser for Liberal Party, and all I could think about was, as Justin Trudeau left the cabinet meeting, where was his inner circle saying this is the wrong thing to do, to go to a fundraiser on this night? And that inner circle has also been supportive of him losing so many female cabinet ministers. I have questions about his inner circle too. But as the person who takes responsibility for his decisions, I'm not sure there's any good rationale.
And of course, there's also a lot of Indigenous spending on the books. We've been, of course, the Liberals have been phoning us a lot about and the FN has been really pushing this First Nations Clean Water Act. Obviously, things will be, if we go into an election, like things are in danger for Indigenous spending priorities. What do you think about that in terms of how that will be managed in the upcoming months, or maybe how best to, maybe for the organizations that want to see this funding get spent, how do they manage that?
I'm not sure that funding and the government's budgeting is getting enough attention, actually, in all the media. We are being inundated with other stories around what's going on in the U.S. I think we're looking at, overall, a total budget in the federal government of some pretty significant cuts, although the government has also done some massive hiring. Indigenous Services Canada has over 7,000 full-time equivalent positions right now. That's a dramatic increase. Should there be cuts? Possibly. It should happen within the department and not touch what is going to communities. If this government believed in reconciliation, not a single dollar in grants and contributions will be touched going to community.
Okay, well, we'll have to end it there, unfortunately, but as always, a pleasure, and thanks for joining us today on Nation Nation.
Thank you.
Up next, we'll talk to Andrea Sandmeyer, the president of the Métis Nation of Alberta, about the federal government's recent decision not to move forward on Bill C-53. Welcome back. Métis governments in Ontario and Alberta were dealt a big blow last week with the announcement that Ottawa will not be moving forward on Bill C-53. It would have formally recognized Métis governments in Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. However, Saskatchewan withdrew from both the legislation and the Métis National Council earlier this year. Alberta and Ontario are now the only governments that support the MNC. And joining us today to talk about it and all that is happening is Andrea Sandmeyer, who's the president of the Métis Nation of Alberta. Welcome back to Nation to Nation, President Sandmeyer.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Fraser.
Okay, so I thought I might ask you first, before we get into C-53, before the break, we talked to Hill Times columnist Rose LeMay, and she told us that she doesn't see a clear path forward for the Métis National Council with some of the problems that are currently going on there. What's your opinion on this?
Yes, so last week we did have our Métis National Council assembly and an election and have a new president, Victoria Pruden. And we have been committed for a while now to reform of the Métis National Council. Métis National Council is not a government. It has never been a government. And similar to other national Indigenous organizations, we're going through a reform process.
And I guess that's the other question that I know there was, the election was delayed for president, but you did elect, as you say, Victoria Pruden. Do Métis still have a national voice, though, in Ottawa at this time?
Yes, I believe we do. We have our president, and Victoria Pruden is ready to get started and has her feet under her and a great support system around her. Like I said, the Métis National Council is not a government. The Otipemisiwak Métis government represents our citizens.
All right, and as promised, I'll move now to Bill C-53. I imagine that we got your statement last Friday when it kind of broke, or the minister already kind of broke it earlier in the week, I guess, in a committee meeting that the government would not be moving forward. That after all the work that you've put into it, or your organization in Ontario, that must have been a bit of a blow, or a bit disappointing for you.
Well, our self-government journey is not tied to the outcome of any single piece of legislation. And the self-governance agreement that we've signed with Canada in February 2023 set out a clear path to put into place a nation-to-nation, government-to-government treaty, as well as ensure our treaty is legislatively recognized and constitutionally protected. So we will continue on our path for the Métis Nation citizens within Alberta on our path with Canada to that full recognition.
Okay, and I wanted to ask you your take as well with the Crown Indigenous Relations Minister. To be fair, he really has not been clear about this legislation. He first told us very committed to it, and this was up until very recently. Decided to make this announcement of all places in a committee meeting. There was no formal press release. It's still not clear what they plan to do with the legislation. Most of you would tell us is it's on pause. So what, have you been in contact with the minister? Did they give you a clear answer of what they're doing or where they plan to go next in terms of, these self-government agreements?
When I was in Ottawa last week, I actually did meet with Minister Andesangri, and we had a good meeting, and they're committed to self-determination and recognizing our Otipemisiwak Métis government and moving forward with treaty negotiations with us.
So you still feel you're on the same page, I guess, or?
We are on a path to self-determination. Yes.
Okay, and just not to, much of the problem we've seen them covered lots of stories on this topic, and what comes up from First Nations in Ontario and the Manitoba Métis Federation is they don't really have any problem with the Métis Nation of Alberta. It all seems to focus on the Métis Nation of Ontario, their membership lists, communities in dispute that are contested for that Métis. Now, I know that you're with the Métis Nation of Ontario in terms of still being part of the MNC and part of this legislation. Just in terms of another sort of view on this, how do you think this maybe can be resolved with some of the criticism of the Métis Nation of Ontario, and so that everybody, I suppose, can get back on the same page for Métis governments in the country?
It's not our government's place to comment on how other Métis governments recognize citizenship for their government. We're focused on our government, our citizens within the Métis Nation of Alberta, and our path forward with Canada to self-determination and self-government.
And I guess it's fair to say that your government does see the Métis Nation of Ontario as legitimate, though?
As I said before, we are responsible for our own citizenship and registry. Métis Nation of Ontario has always been a good partner with Alberta, and we are both focused on our own path to self-determination.
Okay, and you might have been watching. It's a pretty wild week in Ottawa here with lots of things happening. Lots of questions about how long the government may carry on. If there was an election today, if you read the polls, it would be a Conservative government. Have you had any contact with the Conservatives about your self-government legislation and how you may approach going forward if there is a change in government and the Conservatives take power sometime next year?
Of course, through the whole INAN process, we did meet regularly with all parties, and no matter what happens within the government of Canada, the next election, who forms government, they need to, whoever that government is, will need to honor the commitment. It is, a constitutional imperative to move forward with self-determination and recognition for Métis across the homeland. It is a huge step of reconciliation and reconciling, recognizing the Métis within the homeland and the Métis citizens within our government, the Otipemisiwak Métis government.
Okay, well, we'll have to end it there, but as always, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Fraser, and happy holidays.
Happy holidays to you. That concludes this week's episode of Nation to Nation. If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast at aptnnews.ca/podcast. This is also the last episode of Nation Nation for 2024. From all of us here on the show, Joseph Saunders, John Cook, Brendan Hennigan, Leighton Day, Todd Lamarond, and myself, we wish you and your family a safe and happy holiday season. I'm Fraser Needham. Good night.